Hello everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Dar's Nights. I know many of you use these videos to relax or fall asleep, so before you drift off, leave a comment and let me know where you're listening from. And if you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to like and subscribe. Now let's get comfortable and begin. You ever get the feeling your home is trying to tell you something? Most people don't. They hear a creak and chalk it up to the house settling. Pipes rattle and they call a plumber. The wind whistles through cracked windows and they close them without a second thought. But sometimes, the noises we hear at night aren't the house shifting or the wind howling. They're voices, and some of them don't want to be ignored. It started like that for Owen, a quiet, 35-year-old introvert who just moved into a second-floor apartment in a brick building on the outskirts of Millfield. The place was cheap, unassuming, and a bit run down. Perfect for a man looking to escape the buzz of the city. He wasn't running from anything in particular, just life. Owen liked silence, solitude. He didn't like surprises, didn't like loud neighbors, and definitely didn't like confrontation. But this apartment would change all of that. The first night passed in peace. The second, he noticed a few odd thuds beneath his bed. Nothing dramatic, just soft, rhythmic thumps, like someone knocking gently on the floorboards with the side of a closed fist. He assumed it was heating pipes or maybe an animal. He tossed and turned a bit, then eventually fell asleep. The third night was different. At precisely 2:13 a.m., he woke up to the same knocking sound, except this time, it was accompanied by something else. A whimper, faint, fragile, almost too soft to notice. He thought it might have come from outside, or maybe he'd dreamt it. Either way, he pulled the covers over his head and waited for the sun to rise. But it didn't stop. Every night after that, the sounds returned. The knocks came in pairs, 2 soft taps followed by a pause. Then more whimpering, then crying. Not loud or dramatic, quiet, muffled, like someone sobbing through fabric or speaking from under the floor. It sent chills crawling up Owen's spine. He tried everything. Sleeping with headphones, moving his bed to the other side of the room, even sleeping on the couch. But the noises followed him. Always beneath him, always at the same hour. Then came the voice. It was the 7th night when he heard it clearly. A hoarse whisper, no louder than a breath, but distinct enough to make out 3 words. "Help, I'm still here." Owen froze. He sat up in bed, heart pounding in his ears, eyes wide in the dark. The whisper didn't come again, just the knocks, 2 soft taps, then silence. He told himself he was imagining things. He hadn't slept well in days. Maybe he was hallucinating, but part of him knew. The floor was speaking, and he could no longer ignore it. That morning, he did something he hadn't done before. He lifted the corner of his rug and pressed his ear to the wooden floorboards. Nothing, just stillness. But when he knocked 2 taps, it answered. 2 taps back. He yanked his head up, nearly screaming. It wasn't a rat. It wasn't pipes. Something was under there. Something that could hear him. Something that wanted him to know. That day, he spoke to the landlord. "Old building," the landlord grunted, brushing off Owen's concern. "Lots of strange sounds. Floors settle. Pipes bang. Ghosts moan. You'll get used to it." Owen didn't laugh. That night, he didn't sleep. Instead, he grabbed a flashlight, a hammer, and a crowbar, and knelt beside his bed. The knocking had started early this time, 1:58 a.m. He whispered, "I hear you," and began to pull at the floorboards. The wood was older than he thought, dry, brittle, and discolored. Came up easier than expected. With each plank removed, the air grew colder. The floor beneath was dark and hollow, the smell of damp rot curling up to meet him. He reached into the gap with his flashlight. At first, he saw only dust and cobwebs. But then, something caught the light. A notebook. No, not just a notebook. A diary. It was small, leather-bound, with faded gold lettering across the front. Emily. The pages were yellowed, corners torn. But the writing inside was fresh enough to read. The first page chilled him to the bone. My name is Emily. I've been under here for 43 days. If you're reading this, I'm probably dead. Owen slammed the book shut, stumbling backward. He stared at the open floor, half expecting a hand to reach up. Nothing moved. Nothing whispered. Not that night. But the next night, the voice returned. And this time, it sounded closer. Don't leave me. He read the diary the next day. Every page a cry for help. Emily had been a runaway, 16, lured by a man she met at a gas station. He promised her safety, place to stay, but what she found was darkness. He locked her under the floor, fed her scraps, and told her no one would hear her scream. She wrote until she couldn't write anymore. The entries got shorter, the handwriting weaker. The last line read, "Someone else is here now. I hear him crying too. He won't answer me." Owen stared at that final sentence for hours. Someone else? The police wouldn't help. He knew that. There was no body, no crime, just an old diary in a creaky apartment. He didn't tell anyone. He didn't want to be labeled insane. But he couldn't stop thinking about the knocking, the whispers, and the smell. There was more down there. That night, he widened the hole. What he found beneath the boards wasn't just empty crawl space. It was a tunnel, carved into the foundation, a narrow path leading toward the far wall, dark, tight, and silent. He didn't go in. Not yet. Instead, he left the diary on his nightstand and tried to sleep. He needed time to think. He needed to process. But the apartment wouldn't let him. 3 a.m. he heard scratching, then whispers, then laughter, low, guttural, cruel, and finally, a voice. Not Emily's. Deeper, closer, right beneath him. She's not the only one. They all cried. They all begged. Owen didn't scream. He just sat there, frozen in his bed, the diary open beside him, the tunnel gaping at his feet. And for the first time since he moved in, he realized he wasn't alone. The next morning, Owen sat in the middle of his bedroom, knees drawn to his chest, the sunlight creeping across the rug like a timid guest. The diary sat open beside him, its final sentence burned into his mind. Someone else is here now. I hear him crying too. He won't answer me. The tunnel yawned at the foot of his bed. The boards peeled back like wounded skin. Something beneath this apartment had consumed people. Quietly, slowly, and with purpose. Owen hadn't just found a diary. He'd cracked open a crypt. He considered sealing it back up, pretending it never happened. Just a bad dream in an old apartment. That would have been the sane thing to do. But Owen wasn't sane anymore, not after the voice. Not after the laughter. The smell had worsened. Not the sharp sting of decay, but something sour and old, like rotting paper or mold-covered clothing left too long in the dark. It wafted from the tunnel every time he walked near it. That day he didn't eat. He barely drank. He just watched the tunnel and waited for nightfall, like a man staring at his own grave. When the knocking began again at 2:13 a.m., Owen was ready. He didn't jump. He didn't speak. He slid into the hole without a sound, flashlight clutched in shaking fingers. The tunnel was narrower than he'd expected, just tall enough to crawl. The walls were damp earth, packed tightly, with shreds of old cloth and hair embedded like fossils. His breath fogged in front of him. The cold here wasn't just from lack of sunlight, it was the kind of cold that felt personal. The kind that wrapped itself around your bones and whispered your name. He crawled for what felt like hours, though his phone would later tell him it had only been 12 minutes. That's when he saw it. A chamber, small, square, barely 6 feet across. The ceiling was low, cobwebs dangling like nooses, and there, in the center, was another diary. This one was bound in black. No name on the cover, just a smear of dried blood. Owen hesitated, then reached for it. The first page read, Isaiah, 1993. If anyone finds this, I don't know how long I've been here. I hear her, the girl. She talks to me at night. I think I'm next. His heart thumped like a drum in his chest. Isaiah. Another name, another voice. He flipped through the pages. This diary was different. Frantic, rambling, words scratched into the paper like fingernails scraping flesh. Isaiah had been living in the same apartment nearly 3 decades ago. He'd found the tunnel too. He heard the crying, the same knocking. He tried to escape, but something had kept him. I saw him, the man with the voice. He's not alive, not dead either. He lives in the walls. He waits. He feeds. He remembers us. Owen slammed the diary shut. He turned to crawl back, but paused. Another object caught the edge of his light. A shoe, children's size, tattered, faded blue, the heel torn. Beside it, a cracked plastic bracelet with little colored beads that spelled out Lily. He froze. More names, more forgotten children. This was no crawl space. It was a graveyard. He backed out fast, not daring to look behind him, terrified something would be crawling just inches from his heels. The moment he reached his bedroom, he slammed the floorboards shut and pushed the bed over the opening. Not that it would help. He knew better now. You can't block out something that lives inside the walls. Sleep didn't come that night. The knocking changed. Now it came in 3 taps. Slower, louder, as if whatever was down there was knocking back harder. Then came the scratching. It started just beneath the bed, nails dragging across the floorboards, slow and deliberate. It moved toward the door, then the closet, then stopped. Owen sat in silence, holding the diary, the first and second now stacked together. There was no denying it anymore. The apartment had a history, a dark one the landlord wouldn't admit, and the neighbors didn't speak of. The next day, Owen visited the local library. It was a small place, tucked between a laundromat and a diner. He asked the old librarian if she had any archives, something on the building he lived in. Her eyes narrowed when he gave the address. "That place?" she muttered. "I thought they tore it down years ago." They hadn't, but the original structure had been condemned once. Back in the late 80s, there had been stories. A missing girl, then a tenant who vanished in the night. Cops searched the place top to bottom. Found nothing. No bodies. No signs of struggle. Just silence. The case was closed. Disappearances written off as runaways, drug addicts, or mental illness. But one article caught Owen's eye. Dated 1991. Local boy claims to hear voices in the floor. The photo was grainy, but the boy in the picture looked scared, pale with wide, sleepless eyes. The name? Isaiah Bennett. He told police he heard children crying. Said someone was trapped beneath the floorboards. They dismissed him. His parents moved him out of the apartment. A week later, he went missing. Last seen returning to the building alone. Owen's stomach twisted. Isaiah had returned. He'd found the tunnel, and he died there. The librarian looked at Owen and said something that stayed with him. That place doesn't let go of people. Once it knows your name, it never forgets. He left the library shaking. When he got home, the floor was already open. The boards had been ripped up, his bed shoved aside. No footprints, no signs of forced entry, just the hole wider now. And a third diary on the floor. This one was red, the pages damp. No name, just one phrase scribbled over and over again. Don't listen to the voice. Don't listen. Don't listen. Don't Lee. It trailed off into jagged scratches. Owen backed out of the room. The voice came again that night, but it wasn't a whisper. It was a scream, raw, guttural, like lungs filled with dirt and blood were forcing out their final plea. "Help me!" Then silence, and then laughter, soft, deep, like someone amused by the panic it caused. Owen left the apartment the next morning. He booked a motel on the other side of town. Tried to sleep in a strange bed with strangers laughing in the room next door and a vending machine buzzing in the hallway. But it followed him. At exactly 2:13 a.m., the vending machine stopped humming. The lights flickered, and from under the motel bed came 2 soft taps. Tap, tap, then a whisper. "I said don't leave me." Owen fled, back to the apartment, back to the hole. He had to end it. Had to see how deep it went. Had to know the truth. Because if it could follow him outside, if it had his name now, there was no escaping it. When he returned, he found the walls covered in symbols. Not drawn, scratched. Deep gouges into the paint. Circles, crosses, runes he didn't recognize. The diaries were scattered across the floor. The red one had opened to a new page. "You're the last one, Owen. It's hungry." And beside the diary, scratched into the wooden floor with something sharp and rusted, were 5 words. "Write yours before it eats." The tunnel was darker now, felt alive, and it was waiting for him. Owen didn't remember walking into the tunnel. He remembered standing in the living room, holding the final diary, fingers trembling. He remembered the words carved into the wood. "Write yours before it eats." He remembered the scream the night before, the voice under the motel bed, the laughter that followed him like a shadow. But he didn't remember dropping to his knees and crawling in. Yet here he was, deeper than before. The tunnel no longer looked like a crude, man-made hole. Twisted now, bent in strange, unnatural angles like the inside of a throat. The walls were darker too, slick and soft. With every shuffle forward, his palms sank into the earth a little more. The smell was worse here. It wasn't rot anymore. It was warm, breathing. Somewhere up ahead, something exhaled. Slow, wet, a sound like lungs filled with mud letting go. Owen's flashlight flickered, then blinked out. He screamed, but the tunnel swallowed the sound. He fumbled for his phone, but the screen refused to turn on. Dead. All of it. No light, no time, just the slow, rhythmic sound of something very large, inhaling. He crawled faster. The tunnel opened up again into a wide chamber, not like before. This one was circular, like a well had been carved from the center of the earth. The walls were lined with dozens of items. Shoes, toys, tiny backpacks, each placed neatly against the wall as if arranged by someone who cared or someone who was keeping score. In the center of the room sat a wooden chair, old, worn, splinters jutting out from the armrests. Leather straps hung from the sides, crusted in rust and something darker. On the floor beneath it, bones, small, child-sized. A second chair sat across from the first, bigger, waiting. Owen didn't sit. He couldn't. Not when the walls began to move. Not shake, move. They pulsed inward, then out in slow rhythm like a heartbeat too large to belong to anything human. The air turned thick, humid. Breathing became a task. Every exhale burned. Then he saw it. Not clearly, never clearly, but the shape was there. A figure, tall, impossibly thin, hunched in the far corner where the shadows were thickest. Limbs too long, head tilted, watching. It didn't move. It didn't speak. But Owen knew. It was the one behind the voice. He could feel it pressing into his thoughts. Not with words, with memories, regret, guilt, all the things he'd buried rising up like bile in his throat. A low whisper scraped across the room. "It's your turn." He stepped back. The floor gave way beneath him, falling. Freezing wind screamed past him as he plunged into darkness. Then impact. Pain seared up his spine. Everything blurred. He lay there for minutes, hours. Time didn't matter here. Then a voice, inches from his ear. "I helped them. Now you help me." He scrambled to his feet. A light flickered ahead. Soft, yellow. A single bulb hanging over a table. On it, another diary. Blank. Pen beside it. Open and waiting. And behind it, a wall. But not a normal wall. This one was covered in faces. Not real ones, etchings. Dozens. Hundreds. Scratched into the stone. Screaming mouths and wide eyes. Each face frozen mid-howl. Hands reaching out as if clawing for the surface. Owen stepped closer. He recognized one. It was Isaiah. And beside him, Lily. Then others. Faces from news clippings. Faces from missing posters. All trapped in the stone. all still moving. Not dead, not alive, just remembered. The creature fed on memory. It devoured identity. It didn't kill. It erased. A voice crawled up from the floor. Write or be forgotten. Owen picked up the pen, hands shaking. The moment the tip touched the paper, the screaming started again. Voices begging, crying, warning. Some spoke in languages he didn't understand. Others repeated his name over and over. Owen, Owen, Owen. He wrote anyway. Name, age, the story so far. Everything, like a final confession. As he wrote, the walls pulsed, the faces wept, and the creature stepped forward. Closer now. His face was empty. No eyes, no mouth, just skin stretched too tight over something too large. His fingers ended in bone. It reached out, but did not touch. It waited, watching. When Owen finished the last word, the diary snapped shut on its own. The creature stopped, tilted its head, approved. A low hiss filled the chamber. Then silence. Owen was still there, alive. He looked down. The diary had changed. His name etched into the cover now. Deep, permanent. A new voice echoed behind him. Small, familiar. You heard me, didn't you? He turned. Lily stood in the shadows, no older than 10, pale, dirt-smudged, eyes wide with hope. You found me, she whispered. Owen's heart broke. He stepped forward, but she shook her head. You can't stay. It'll keep you. The tunnel behind her opened, light pouring in from somewhere far, far above. Run. So he did, crawled, faster than before. The air burned. The walls moaned. The creature howled behind him, angry now, betrayed. Another voice escaping its grasp. He reached the bedroom floor, clawed his way through. The floorboards sealed behind him with a slam. He collapsed. Daylight. The world had returned. Owen lay on the wooden floor, gasping, shaking. The apartment was silent, normal. No voices, no knocking, no laughter. Just the sound of traffic outside and birds singing beyond the window. He moved the bed back over the hole, bolted it to the wall, sealed the boards with nails and glue and everything he could find. But he didn't leave. Not yet, because when he looked across the room, he saw the diaries on his shelf. All of them, Isaiah's, Lily's, his own, and a fourth one, blank, waiting. That night, at 2:13 a.m., he didn't hear knocking. He heard crying, not beneath the floor, but through the wall, soft, childlike. Another one, a new tenant maybe, already hearing the voice. Owen sat down, picked up the pen, opened the blank diary, and began to write. If you're reading this, I'm sorry. I tried to stop it. I tried to close the hole. But it remembers. It always remembers. And now, it knows your name too. The last page held a warning, scratched so deep it tore through the paper. Don't listen to the voice. Don't answer the knock. And whatever you do, never open the floor. The crying stopped. Silence returned. But the voice beneath the floorboards was just beginning to whisper again. STROY2. You ever get that feeling someone's watching you even when you're the only one in the room? That's how Malcolm felt every time he went into the hospital basement. He'd been working the night shift at Briar Hill Memorial for 6 years, cleaning floors, hauling garbage, wiping up blood that always managed to drip just where no one else could reach. The hospital was old, built in the 1920s, all cracked paint and flickering lights, the kind of place that whispered things when no one else was around. But Malcolm didn't mind the silence. He liked the quiet hum of the fluorescents overhead. He liked being alone. Until that Tuesday, the night started like any other. He punched in at 10:06 p.m., late by 6 minutes, same as always. Coffee in one hand, hearing jangling on his belt, headphones in, listening to some old R&B while pushing his cart down the empty hallway. He was assigned to sublevel B that night. That's what the clipboard said, though he couldn't remember the hospital having a sublevel B. There was a sublevel A, sure, that's where they kept maintenance, water tanks, old surgical records, and the rooms no one cleaned anymore. But B? Never heard of it. Still, orders were orders. Malcolm took the service elevator down past the usual level. The buttons lit up like normal until it hit B. When he stepped out, the hallway looked wrong. Not dirty, just forgotten. Like someone had sealed it off long before he was born and never bothered to unlock it. Dust floated through the air like ash. The walls were stained brown and yellow, and the air smelled thick, like copper and mildew and something burnt. He pushed his cart forward. No rooms, no signs. Just a hallway that stretched straight for 30 yards before ending in a solid black door. There wasn't a handle, just a slot where a nameplate used to be and a heavy keyhole beneath it, already rusted. Malcolm reached for his keyring. Dozens of keys, some he never used. One of them, a small brass one with no tag, looked like it might fit. He tried it. The lock clicked open, and the door swung in on its own. He should have walked away right then. He wanted to walk away, but the smell that poured out was freezing cold, so sharp and sudden it almost made him dizzy. Not rotting, not dead, something else, preserved. Inside was a morgue. At least it looked like one. Steel drawers lined the walls, stacked for high. Some open, some shut, all spotless. No dust inside, no cobwebs. There were bodies, covered in white sheets. Maybe a dozen. He stepped closer. The room was colder than anything he'd felt before. His breath came out in clouds. His skin prickled. His cart's wheels squeaked loud enough to echo, though the room had no depth. The echoes hit back too fast, too loud. He pulled back one of the sheets. The body underneath was a man, mid-30s, eyes closed, skin pale but not rotted. No smell, no decay, fresh. Except this morgue, it hadn't been touched in 50 years. There was a date scrawled on a clipboard beside the drawer. June 12th, 1975. Malcolm checked the others. A woman, a child, another man. Each had a date. Then, 2023. That one stopped him. He looked down at the man on the slab and felt the world tilt sideways. It was him. Same face, same stubble. Same scar on his left eyebrow, same uniform, same badge on his chest. Malcolm Vance, Janitorial Services. He stumbled back, knocking the cart into the wall. The drawer behind him creaked open on its own. He turned. Inside was another body. This one hadn't died yet. It looked like him too, but different. Wounded, cuts on his arms, a deep bruise on his throat, dried blood in his ears and nose. He stared at it. The eyes opened. Just a flicker. Just long enough to look at him. Then it went still. Malcolm ran. He didn't remember the hallway. Didn't remember the elevator ride up. Just cold sweat and blind panic. By the time he reached the ground floor, everything looked normal again. Bright lights. Clean floors. A nurse glanced at him and frowned. "You okay?" she asked. "You look like you saw a ghost." He tried to answer, couldn't speak. His voice gone, burnt out. Something in his throat felt bruised. That night at home he locked every door, drank until the shaking stopped. But as he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, something nagged at him. The cut on his forearm. It hadn't been there before. The blood in his ear, the ache in his neck. He looked in the mirror and touched the bruise beneath his chin. Deep blue. Just like the corpse had. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "We're not dead yet. You just forgot." Malcolm dropped the phone, stared at his reflection, and realized something terrifying. The body wasn't just his double. It was him. Soon, if he didn't find out what that morgue really was, he'd end up there, preserved, remembered, filed away, in a place no one even knew existed. The hospital had always been a place of life and death, but it was nothing like this. Malcolm couldn't stop shaking. No matter how much he tried to convince himself that he hadn't seen what he thought he saw, the truth clung to him like the cold sweat on his back. He should have reported it. told someone about the morgue, about the bodies, about the man who looked exactly like him, but he couldn't bring himself to speak it out loud. Something in his gut told him that if he did, he would never leave the hospital. The morgue would pull him back, and what had happened to him there would continue until it finished its work. The next night, he was back. He told himself he needed answers. He couldn't sleep, couldn't think, couldn't breathe without knowing why it had happened, what it meant. Was it a mistake? A trick of the mind? But deep down, he knew it wasn't. He knew he had seen himself on that slab, his own face staring back at him. It was almost midnight when he returned to the hospital, heart pounding in his chest. His keyring felt heavier tonight, each key cold under his fingertips. He didn't take the elevator this time. He couldn't bear to let it close in on him again. Instead, he took the stairs to the basement. The hallways down below were quieter than usual, like the building itself was holding its breath. He moved in silence, the only sound the scrape of his sneakers against the concrete floor. The air smelled faintly of chemicals and dust, a stagnant heaviness that clung to the back of his throat. When he reached the door, the one that hadn't been there yesterday, his breath caught in his throat. The door was ajar. He didn't remember leaving it like that. He didn't remember even unlocking it. The key was still in his hand. A strange chill ran through him as he pushed the door open. His mind screamed at him to turn around and leave, but his feet betrayed him. He stepped inside, and the temperature dropped even further. Felt like walking into a tomb. The morgue was just as it had been before. The bodies lay on their metal slabs, covered with clean white sheets. The faint smell of decay clung to the air, mingling with the bitter scent of antiseptic. But it wasn't the smell that made his skin crawl. It was the silence, the stillness. Something about it felt wrong. He moved deeper into the room, his eyes scanning the bodies. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching him. He stopped at the same drawer where he had found his doppelganger. He glanced at the clipboard. The date was the same, June 12, 1975. But something was different. The body that had been there before was gone. In its place was a new corpse, a man who looked eerily familiar, but not quite right. His skin was pale, stretched tight across his skull. His eyes were half open, and his mouth hung slightly ajar as though he'd been caught in a scream that never escaped. There was something in the way his face was frozen in that twisted expression that made Malcolm's heart skip a beat. A mirror image, not of himself this time, but of someone else. Someone he recognized. His brother. The resemblance was undeniable. The scar on the forehead, the slight indentation on the nose, the way the jaw was set, just like his brother's. But his brother had died years ago, in a car accident, a collision that had torn him apart, left nothing but twisted metal and mangled bones. So how was he here? How was his brother's body lying on a slab, so perfectly preserved, so alive in a way that made Malcolm's blood run cold? His breath caught in his throat, and he stumbled backward. His hand hit the metal drawer next to him, sending a loud metallic clang through the room. For a moment, everything felt like it was happening in slow motion. The air around him thickened, grew heavy. Then he heard it. A voice, soft, distant, but unmistakable. "Malcolm!" He froze. Came again, louder this time. "Malcolm!" His heart raced as he spun around, scanning the room. His pulse thundered in his ears, drowning out everything else. No one was there. The room was empty, save for the rows of bodies, still as death itself. But the voice, it felt so real. He was not alone. The sound echoed again, this time from a corner of the room he hadn't noticed before. A small alcove hidden in the shadows. He couldn't tell if it was a wall or another room. There was a faint glow coming from the crack in the wall, like a soft light seeping through a crack in reality itself. Against every instinct in his body, Malcolm found himself walking toward it. With each step, the voice grew clearer. "Malcolm, you can't escape." The walls seemed to close in, the hallway stretching longer as he got closer. His feet dragged, as if something was pulling him forward. His head felt light, as though he was drifting through a fog. He was no longer sure if he was awake or if this was some nightmare he couldn't wake up from. The crack in the wall seemed to pulse, growing larger, inviting him in. And then, just as his fingertips brushed the edge of the opening, he heard something else. A soft laugh, low, guttural, like a whisper from a long-dead corpse. Malcolm froze. There, in the darkness, something moved. A shadow. And then he saw it. A face. Not his brother's. Not anyone he recognized. A face twisted in a grotesque, frozen grin. Its eyes black, lifeless. A man. No, something that had once been a man. He reached out, his bony hand stretching through the crack in the wall, as though it was trying to pull him in. Malcolm screamed. He turned on his heels and ran, faster than he'd ever run in his life, his heart pounding against his chest like a drumbeat of impending doom. But the door, his only escape, was gone. The walls were closing in. The faces in the morgue were alive, watching him, whispering his name. He was trapped. Malcolm's feet pounded against the cold concrete floor, the sound echoing like a death knell in the silence of the basement. His chest heaved, each breath coming in ragged gasps as he sprinted through the darkened halls. Sweat stung his eyes, but it was the cold that gnawed at his bones, making it feel as though the very walls were alive, breathing, shifting, closing in around him. He had to get out. He didn't know where the exit was, didn't know how he'd gotten so deep into this godforsaken place. But every step he took seemed to lead him deeper into a nightmare from which there was no waking. The door, the only door that had opened to the morgue, was gone. In its place, just an endless stretch of cracked, crumbling walls. Behind him, a whisper. Malcolm! He spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. No one, just shadows. He pushed forward, terror clawing at his insides, but something in the darkness kept following him. The faint sound of footsteps, not his own, trailing just behind. It wasn't possible. He was alone. He had to be alone. The basement stretched ahead, an endless maze of forgotten rooms and long-abandoned hallways. The dim emergency lights flickered intermittently, casting long, grotesque shadows along the walls. It felt as if the very structure of the building was warping around him, bending reality, until the hallways themselves seemed to fold and twist in unnatural directions. The once familiar layout of Briar Hill Memorial Hospital was no longer recognizable. It had become something else, something ancient, something that didn't belong. And there was a feeling, no, a certainty that something was alive here, something dark, something hungry. He had to get back to the surface, back to the world where people were alive, where things made sense. But his legs were starting to feel numb, his body heavy with the weight of the unseen force trailing behind him. Every time he looked over his shoulder, the shadows seemed to shift, to move just a little too quickly for comfort. And then he heard it again. Malcolm! It was different this time, closer, louder, as if the very walls themselves were speaking his name. He rounded a corner, breath coming in short bursts, but the hallway stretched out further, twisting into an impossible loop. He had been here before. He had been here before. This was the spot. This was the moment that had led him into the morgue. But there was no door, no way to escape. He backed up against the wall, sweat soaking his shirt as his mind raced. The voice came again, and this time it wasn't just his name that echoed through the cold air. We are all here. Malcolm froze. A new presence filled the space, crawling along the edges of his mind. Something was in the air now, suffocating him with its weight. Something that knew him, that understood him. And just as his heart began to pound in his chest, the temperature dropped even further, and his breath turned to mist before his eyes. You belong to us. The voice was now a chorus, 1,000 whispers rising in a single, terrifying crescendo. All around him, the shadows began to shift, their movements too quick, too deliberate. And then they stopped. A shape began to form before him. At first, just a ripple in the air, like a distortion in the fabric of reality. But then it solidified. A figure, tall and thin, emerged from the shadows. It was humanoid, but its features were wrong. Its face was obscured, a blur of shifting images, but Malcolm could feel its eyes on him, deep, dark eyes that seemed to see into his very soul. And then it spoke. "You should have never come back, Malcolm." The voice wasn't the same as the others. It was deeper, heavier, like a thunderclap rolling in the distance. Malcolm's heart thudded in his chest as he took a step back. The thing in front of him didn't move. It just watched him, as if waiting for him to understand something that he had missed. He glanced around, frantic. The hallways were closing in, the shadows growing thicker, and the walls were now pulsing, alive with an energy that he couldn't comprehend. "We never die." The words sent a shockwave through his body, a ripple that coursed through his veins and settled in his bones. The world seemed to tilt on its axis, spinning, twisting. He couldn't breathe. His chest constricted as he felt the weight of 1,000 souls pressing down on him. The figure reached forward, its hands elongated, skeletal, fingers curling like claws. It moved with unnatural speed, the shadows following it like a cloak. Malcolm tried to step back, but his legs wouldn't move. The air was too thick. His vision blurred, and for a moment he thought he might pass out. The figure leaned in closer, its face still hidden, but the voice that came from it was unmistakable. "You were never meant to leave." Malcolm's mind raced. He had to get away, had to escape, but the thing was too close now. Its presence suffocated him, the darkness closing in around him like a noose. He reached for the nearest object, a metal pipe that had been left leaning against the wall, but as his fingers brushed it, it shattered into dust, as if it had never existed in the first place. Desperation surged within him. He slammed his hands against the walls, hoping for something, anything, to break through the nightmare. But all he felt was the cold, slick surface of the stone, unyielding, as if the building itself was alive, refusing to let him go. The figure in front of him tilted its head, as if it were studying him. The shadows seemed to swallow the space between them. "This is your end, Malcolm." A sharp pain shot through his chest, and he gasped, his knees buckling beneath him. The world around him faded, the edges blurring, and for a moment, it felt like he was falling into an endless void. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the darkness stopped. The shadows retreated, and the air became thin, breathable again. The figure disappeared as though it had never been there. Malcolm found himself standing in the hallway once more. The voices had stopped. The pressure had lifted. He was alone, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching him. The figure, the morgue, the twisted, preserved bodies. All of it had been real, and now something was waiting for him. Something that had always been there, just beneath the surface, just beyond the door he had opened. He could still hear it in his mind, echoing softly, like a whisper in the back of his brain. "You belong to us." The walls closed in, and the door that had once been gone, was now wide open. And Story 3. The small town of Ravenshade was always quiet. The kind of place where nothing ever happened until it did. The local diner, with its cracked leather booths and fading neon sign, had been the heart of the town for as long as anyone could remember. And across the street, there stood the old public phone booth. It was a relic from a time before cell phones, its glass walls now cracked and dirty, its red paint peeling like old skin. Few people used it anymore, and those who did never stayed long. There was something off about it. That night, however, the phone booth would come to life in a way that no one could have predicted. It was just after midnight when Tom Halloway, a 27-year-old mechanic who had worked late at the garage, walked down the main street. His work shirt was stained with grease, his hair matted from sweat, and his mind was still lost in the fog of a long day. He paused when he saw the phone booth across the street, its pale light flickering eerily in the night. Something was wrong. Tom could feel it deep in his gut, that familiar sense of unease that had grown in the town over the past few months. People had been disappearing. At first, it was just rumors, strange disappearances of people who were last seen near the phone booth. But then it became too much to ignore. Another one gone last week, Mayor Jenkins had said in hushed tones at the diner. No sign of struggle, just vanished. Tom had never paid much attention to gossip, but the more he heard, the more it began to eat at him. A year ago, the booth had been a quiet, almost forgotten part of the town. But now the stories had started. Stories about the last words of those who disappeared. He answered. It was always the same. Tom pulled his jacket tighter around himself and decided he'd make his way home before he got caught up in another round of town gossip. But as he passed the booth, a strange impulse gripped him. He hadn't used the phone booth in years. But tonight, something felt different. As he approached, he noticed the booth was empty. The receiver hung loosely from its cord, swinging slightly in the cold night breeze. A faint static buzz emanated from the earpiece. His heart skipped a beat. Tom glanced around, feeling a chill creeping up his spine. Something about the booth felt wrong, but he wasn't one to back down from something as simple as a phone booth. He stepped inside, the door creaking as it opened. The smell of old rubber and metal filled the air as he picked up the receiver. The static was louder now, a hiss like the sound of a broken radio tuning in and out. Then the voice came. Hello! Tom's stomach dropped. It wasn't just any voice. It was familiar, deep and gravelly, like it had been dragged through years of smoke and whiskey. Tom froze. Is this? He stammered, but the voice interrupted him. It's you. I've been waiting for you, the voice said, smooth and calm. But there was an edge to it, something dark, something wrong. The hairs on the back of Tom's neck stood on end. It was a voice he recognized. Rick Dawson. Tom's heart hammered in his chest. There was a brief pause on the other end, then a low chuckle. Good. You remember me. Rick's voice was cold, but there was a rasp to it, like it was coming from somewhere distant. Do you know what happens when you pick up the phone? Tom's blood ran cold. Rick Dawson had been in prison for 20 years, convicted of a series of brutal murders that had rocked Ravenshade. He was notorious, the kind of man you whispered about in dark corners, afraid to even say his name aloud. Rick Dawson had been convicted of killing 5 people, but his confession had never been entirely clear. Some said he was guilty, others believed he was framed, but no one doubted the cruelty in his actions. Tom's hand shook as he gripped the receiver tighter. You're dead, Tom muttered, almost to himself. You died in prison. Did I? Rick's voice came again, a dark laugh following. Does it matter, Tom? I'm still here, still waiting, and now you're part of the game. Tom's mouth went dry as he looked around the booth, as though the walls might close in on him any second. His mind raced. He had to get out, had to leave before it was too late. But as his fingers brushed against the door, something strange happened. The line went dead. The static was replaced by a slow, deliberate dial tone. Tom stood frozen for a moment, the receiver still pressed to his ear. His heart hammered in his chest, and a cold sweat began to form on his brow. But then, a strange feeling washed over him, an undeniable urge to stay, to hear what Rick would say next. He put the receiver back to his ear. Don't hang up. The voice came again, softer now, almost a whisper. I haven't finished yet. Suddenly, the ground beneath him seemed to shift. His head spun, and he felt a chill crawl across his skin as the darkness around him thickened. His vision blurred, the booth stretching in all directions. Tom blinked hard, trying to clear his head, but the feeling of dread only intensified. And then, the voice came again, louder this time. You're not leaving, Tom. Not yet. Before Tom could react, a sound echoed through the booth. The unmistakable click of a door opening somewhere nearby. It was so real, so clear, that he could almost hear the rustling of fabric as if someone were standing right behind him. Tom spun around, his eyes wide with panic, but the booth was still empty. Only the cold, empty space stretched before him. And then he heard it, the faintest whisper from the other end of the line. He answered. Tom had barely managed to sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard that voice, Rick Dawson's voice, echoing in his mind, as cold and as sharp as a blade. The words he answered haunted him like a ghost he couldn't shake off. He tried to convince himself it was a nightmare, some twisted, sleep-deprived hallucination. But deep down, he knew it wasn't. The next day, the world outside felt different. Ravenshade, once so familiar, now seemed like a town he no longer recognized. The streets were quieter, too quiet. Even the birds, usually chirping merrily in the trees, seemed to have disappeared. The usual hum of the diner was replaced with hushed murmurs of conversation, as though everyone was holding their breath. Tom sat at his kitchen table, staring at the phone in front of him. It was his own, but it suddenly felt foreign. The same knot in his stomach that he'd felt the night before came rushing back, and he couldn't help but wonder if the phone call had been some kind of trap. Was Rick Dawson's voice really coming from the afterlife, or was someone playing a sick game? His phone vibrated, and for a moment Tom froze. A text. He glanced down at the screen, half expecting to see something from his friends or work. But no, it wasn't. It was a strange number, one that didn't belong to anyone he knew. "Pick up the phone, Tom. The game has only just begun." His heart skipped a beat. The message was short, but its weight settled heavily on him. There was no denying it now. The phone booth was involved, and somehow he had become entangled in whatever dark game it was playing. But what did it all mean? Tom tried to shake off the creeping panic. He'd gotten messages from unknown numbers before. This could be a prank, a cruel joke. But then his mind raced back to last night, to the voice that had called out to him. It wasn't a prank. Couldn't have been. Determined to get to the bottom of it, Tom grabbed his jacket and headed out the door. He couldn't ignore this any longer. Something was happening in Ravenshade, and if he didn't uncover the truth soon, it might just consume him too. The walk to the phone booth felt like it took forever. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the cracked sidewalks. The familiar streets were now lined with ominous, empty buildings, their windows dark and lifeless. As Tom neared the booth, the air grew colder, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. The phone booth stood there, still as ever, its glass walls smeared with grime. It looked almost out of place, like something that had been forgotten by time, abandoned in the middle of a town that was slowly falling apart. But Tom knew better now. This wasn't just some relic of the past. It was the epicenter of whatever horror had gripped Ravenshade. He hesitated at the edge of the booth, his breath visible in the frigid air. The glass was so grimy he could barely make out the inside, but he could tell that the receiver was hanging loose, just as it had been the night before. A strange impulse overtook him, the need to understand, to find out what was really happening. He reached out, grasping the cold metal door handle, and pushed it open. As he stepped inside, a rush of unease surged through him. It felt wrong, this place, as though the very air was thick with memories. Memories that didn't belong to him. He looked at the receiver, but something stopped him. The last time he had touched it, he had heard Rick's voice. What if that same voice was still waiting? What if it wasn't just a voice, but something far darker? His fingers hovered over the receiver, trembling. He fought the urge to leave, to walk away from this madness, but something kept him rooted in place. He had to know. He had to understand. With a deep breath, he picked up the receiver. The static buzzed again, just as it had the night before, harsh and grating, like nails on a chalkboard. Then, through the static, a voice broke through. "It's you again," the voice said, familiar yet terrifying. It was Rick's voice, but this time, it was softer, more calculated, as though it had been waiting for him. Tom felt a chill crawl down his spine. "I told you, didn't I?" Rick's voice continued, its edge now sharper. "You shouldn't have answered the phone, Tom. You never should have." Tom swallowed hard, his mouth dry as dust. "What do you want from me?" he croaked, his voice barely audible over the static. "Oh, I don't want anything from you, Tom," Rick replied, his tone dripping with mock sympathy. "I'm just keeping you company." After all, you've joined the game now. There's no getting out." Tom clenched his fist around the receiver. The words twisted inside him, suffocating him with their truth. The game. That's what Rick had said. But what was this game? Why him? "You don't have to understand just yet," Rick's voice cooed. "You'll find out soon enough. But first, you need to play." "What do you mean?" Tom asked, though he was afraid of the answer. "I mean, Tom," Rick's voice whispered now, low and venomous, "that you've already made your first mistake. You picked up the phone, and now you're part of the story. And this story, well, let's just say it doesn't have a happy ending." Suddenly, the line went dead. The static buzzed once more, and then there was nothing. Tom stood there, holding the receiver, his mind whirling. It was as though the phone call itself had drained the life out of him. His limbs felt heavy, his heart pounding in his chest. The booth seemed smaller now, more claustrophobic. The air felt thick, as though the walls were closing in. Tom dropped the receiver back onto the hook and stumbled out of the booth, his legs shaking beneath him. He had to leave. He had to get away from this place, from the phone, from the voice that still echoed in his mind. But as he turned to walk away, something caught his eye. A figure was standing at the far end of the street, watching him. It was a man, but his face was obscured by shadows. Tom's blood ran cold. The man took a step forward, and Tom's heart raced in panic. There was something wrong about him, something sinister that Tom couldn't quite place. But before he could move, the man vanished into the darkness, as if he had never been there at all. Tom's stomach twisted. Something was coming, and he had no idea how to stop it. The following days dragged by in a blur for Tom. His once familiar world had become a place of dread, filled with unanswered questions and the echoing remnants of that voice. The voice that had wrapped itself around his soul like an unshakable curse. He couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, and even the smallest sounds in his apartment would send his heart racing, his mind spiraling. It was as if the town itself had changed, as though it was no longer the Ravenshade he had known for so long. The phone booth called to him, pulling him closer, like a siren luring a sailor into a storm. No matter how far he tried to distance himself, no matter how many distractions he tried to fill his days with, he couldn't escape it. He had answered the call, and now there was no turning back. He could still hear Rick Dawson's voice in his mind. Every word, every chilling phrase. The game, the confession, and, most terrifying of all, the idea that there was someone or something waiting for him at the end of it all. Tom's thoughts raced. What did Rick mean when he said, "You're part of the story"? And what was this game? How had it all started? The haunting questions filled his mind like a never-ending storm. But no matter how much he searched for answers, the truth seemed to remain just beyond his grasp, taunting him from the shadows. That night, Tom couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. He wasn't sure how he knew, but he felt it deep in his bones. The same cold, unsettling sensation he had felt when he first picked up the phone. Unable to sit still, Tom found himself pacing around his apartment, restless and on edge. He glanced at the clock on the wall. It was almost midnight, and then it happened. A loud knock at the door. Tom froze. His heart pounded in his chest, his blood turning cold. Who could it be at this hour? No one ever visited him this late. Hesitantly, he approached the door, his feet heavy with dread. He glanced through the peephole, but saw nothing, only darkness. The streetlight outside was flickering, casting erratic shadows against the walls. He opened the door cautiously, the cool night air rushing in. There, standing on his doorstep, was a figure, a man, tall and thin, wearing a dark coat, his face obscured by the shadow of his hat. "Who are you?" Tom demanded, his voice barely above a whisper. But the man didn't respond. Instead, he stepped forward, the tip of his hat tilting slightly upward as if to reveal his face. It was Rick Dawson. Tom's breath caught in his throat. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. How was this possible? Rick had been dead for 20 years. He had died in prison, murdered by an unknown assailant. And yet here he was, standing on Tom's doorstep, like a ghost from the past. His cold, dead eyes stared straight into Tom's, and for a brief moment, it felt as though the entire world around them had frozen. "You've been looking for answers, Tom," Rick's voice croaked, low and gravelly, "but you haven't been asking the right questions." Tom stepped back, his mind reeling. You're dead. How are you here? What do you want?" Rick smiled, a twisted grin that sent a chill down Tom's spine. "I've been waiting for you, waiting for someone who could finish the story of how it all began, and how it all ends." Tom's mind spun. He had no idea what Rick was talking about. "What do you mean? What story?" Rick's grin widened, revealing yellowed teeth. "The story of the phone booth, the game, and, most importantly, the voices I collected." Suddenly, the words hit Tom with a sickening clarity. He remembered the calls. He remembered the voice he had heard in the booth, the same voice that had spoken to him in his nightmares, the voice that had guided him deeper into this twisted tale. Rick continued, his voice growing more intense with each word. "For 20 years, I've been stuck in this place, prison of my own making. The phone booth is the link, the thread that ties everything together. It's the place where the voices of the dead live on. They've been answering the calls I left behind." Tom's pulse quickened. He felt as though he was about to suffocate. "The dead? What are you talking about?" Rick's eyes darkened. "The booth was never just a booth. It was my prison, and now it's yours too. Every voice I collected is trapped there, waiting for someone like you to pick up the phone and finish what I started." Tom's chest tightened. He wanted to run, to escape, but his feet felt glued to the floor. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. The voices he had been hearing were not just from Rick. They were from others too, from everyone who had ever been trapped by the phone booth. He was part of the story now. Rick's laugh echoed in the silence, sending a shiver down Tom's spine. "You don't get it, do you? You're the final piece, the last voice I needed to complete my confession. And when it's over, the phone booth will vanish. But only after you answer." Tom's heart slammed against his ribs. "Answer what? What do you want from me?" Rick stepped closer, his breath cold against Tom's skin. "You're going to confess, Tom, just like everyone else, just like I did before you." Tom staggered backward, his legs weak beneath him. He had no choice now. The phone booth had already claimed him, and soon it would claim his soul as well. He turned and ran. The sound of Rick's laughter followed him as he fled into the night. Story 4. The night shift at Blackstone Penitentiary was always long, but recently it had become unbearable. It started small, faint sounds from the depths of the prison, an eerie echo, too quiet to be certain. But as the weeks passed, the noises became louder, unmistakable. They were coming from Cell 9. Guard Mitchell Barnes, a seasoned officer with 14 years on the job, was the first to notice it. At first, he thought it was the wind, the old pipes groaning under the weight of the building's age. But as the night grew deeper, the sounds grew clearer. A man screaming in terror, his voice breaking through the stillness like a knife through flesh. The first time Barnes heard it, he dismissed it. After all, Blackstone was a notorious place, its walls steeped in violence and madness. There were always rumors of hauntings, of ghosts trapped by their own sins. But when the scream echoed again the next night, he knew something wasn't right. The cell block was silent. The halls were empty. There was no one in Cell 9. That cell had been sealed shut for over 30 years, after the riot that killed several officers and inmates alike. It was condemned, marked for nothing but memories of violence and pain. Yet, the screams persisted, night after night, relentless and desperate. Barnes made his rounds with a growing unease. He tried to ignore the sounds, but each time they came, they gripped him harder. He wasn't the only one who heard them either. Other guards on duty began to whisper about Cell 9, their faces pale, eyes darting nervously in the dark. Something wasn't right. The warden, a tough and hardened man named Harold Vaughn, had heard the rumors as well. He dismissed them as superstition, But when he received yet another report of the strange noise, he decided to investigate. The old prison had a reputation, yes, but Vaughn wasn't a man to believe in ghosts. He believed in facts, in concrete evidence. The idea of an inmate screaming from a sealed cell seemed impossible, yet the reports were consistent. "Barnes, you're with me on this one?" the warden said one cold evening, his voice low, almost as though he didn't want to disturb the building's atmosphere too much. Barnes followed Vaughn down the dimly lit halls of the prison. The air felt thick, like the walls were breathing along with them, an unsettling pressure that seemed to press in on their every step. They approached Cell 9, the infamous cell that had been the site of so much violence during the 1994 riot. The door was rusted, the metal faded with time. A sign above the door marked it as no entry, but this wasn't a sign meant to keep people out. It was a reminder of the tragic past that lingered within those walls. Barnes's eyes shifted nervously to the door. He could almost hear the screams now, despite the absence of sound. He knew the story. Cell 9 had been sealed shut after a series of events that were never fully explained. Inmates had died in the riot, and the aftermath had left behind a kind of ghostly silence. And now, 30 years later, the echoes of those tortured souls seemed to manifest in the form of screams. "Open it," Vaughn ordered. Barnes hesitated. "Warden, are you sure about this?" Vaughn glared at him. "I don't care if it's haunted or cursed, Barnes. I'm not leaving until I know exactly what's going on." The key scraped against the rusted lock as Barnes reluctantly turned it. The door creaked open, the hinges protesting as if waking from a long, tortured sleep. Inside, the cell looked untouched by time. The walls were cracked, the old bed frame still bolted to the ground. But there was no dust, no signs of neglect. And then, there it was again, the scream. It wasn't a loud sound, but a chilling, muffled cry of desperation, like someone calling out from beneath the earth, trapped in the dark. It reverberated in their bones. Both men froze, their breath catching in their throats. I don't hear anything," Barnes whispered, his voice shaky. But as he said it, the scream grew louder. It was a wailing cry that came from the very walls, filling the air with sorrow. Barnes took a tentative step forward, his hand reaching out to the empty space inside the cell. There, in the corner, sat a figure, a man. He was huddled in the fetal position, his head buried in his knees. His clothing was old, ragged and stained, but his face was completely still, his eyes locked downward as if he had not moved for years. His skin was pale, his face gaunt, but his breathing was steady, rhythmic, like a man who had been asleep for far too long. Vaughn's voice trembled as he spoke. "What in God's name?" Barnes took another step forward, a tremor in his legs. Is he alive?" Vaughn reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his flashlight, directing the beam toward the man. The light shone on his face, revealing eyes that were wide open, staring into nothingness. Barnes gasped. He's breathing." But the warden didn't answer. Instead, he stepped closer to the man and crouched down. The closer he got, the more he could see the subtle signs of decay. How the skin seemed to cling to the bones, how the flesh had not rotted despite the years. The man's eyes flicked up. The pupils were dilated, unfocused, and yet the look in his gaze was unmistakable. It was a look of recognition of something that didn't belong here, something wrong. "Who are you?" Vaughn asked, his voice barely a whisper. The man's lips trembled as he opened his mouth to speak. But the words that came out weren't human. No, they weren't words at all. They were sounds, deep guttural moans, like someone trying to scream but being choked by the very air around them. The man's lips parted again, and a hoarse, rasping whisper reached Vaughn's ears. Same night, over and over. It never ends. Help me." Before they could react, the man's head jerked violently, his eyes wide with terror, as though something had snapped inside his mind. And then he went silent. The air in the room grew heavy, like the walls themselves were closing in. Barnes stumbled back, his breath shallow. "What the hell?" Vaughn didn't have time to respond. The man stood abruptly, his movements jerky and unnatural, his body stiff as though it had not moved in years. And when he looked at Barnes and Vaughn again, it was clear that something had shifted in his eyes. He was no longer the broken, desperate man they had seen before. Now he was something else entirely. A hollow, tormented soul trapped in a cycle, a loop that never seemed to end. The man's lips curled into a smile, and for a moment, it felt as though time had stopped. Then, in a voice that was both distant and close, he whispered, "It's tonight again. It's always tonight." The heavy door of cell 9 slammed shut behind them, its echo reverberating through the desolate halls of Blackstone Penitentiary. Mitchell Barnes stood there, his chest rising and falling rapidly, his body frozen in shock. The man in the cell, the one who claimed to have been there for decades, had vanished in the blink of an eye, gone. All that remained was the stench of decay, the heavy, oppressive air, and the faintest hum of a sound, like the room itself was vibrating, repeating the same pattern over and over. What the hell was that? Vaughn's voice cut through the silence, shaky with disbelief. His face was pale, his usual stern demeanor shattered by the inexplicable horror they had just witnessed. Barnes couldn't answer. His mind raced, trying to piece together the impossible scenes he had just witnessed. The man, if that's what he had been, hadn't looked like any prisoner he had ever seen. There was a palpable wrongness about him. His body had been too still, too lifeless. Yet his eyes, those eyes, spoke of something far older, far more haunted than a simple man locked away for years. Warden, what if it's not just him? What if there's something wrong with this place? Barnes finally muttered, his voice a little unsteady. Vaughn stared at the door of cell 9, his brow furrowed in deep thought. What are you saying? That this prison is cursed? His tone was a mix of skepticism and exhaustion. He had heard the stories. Everyone had. But none of the guards had taken them seriously. None of the prisoners had spoken of it openly. It had always been rumors, whispers in the dark. And now it was staring him right in the face. I don't know, but something's off. That man, he wasn't human anymore. It was like he was stuck, like he's been here for years. Barnes rubbed his face, trying to wipe away the shock that still gripped him. Vaughn sighed. Enough. Let's go back to the office. We'll review the security footage. Maybe we can figure out what happened. It's all a mystery, sure, but there's no need to jump to conclusions. But even as he spoke, a cold dread crawled up his spine. He had always believed in facts, logic, reason, and evidence. But now, the fact that something unnatural was happening in the deepest corners of Blackstone was undeniable. As they walked down the cold corridors, the air grew thicker, the shadows longer. It felt like the walls themselves were closing in on them, pressing in on their thoughts, weighing heavily on their every movement. The prison had always felt cold and oppressive, but tonight it felt different. When they reached the security office, the guards on duty were already seated, their faces pale, eyes wide. It was obvious they had heard the rumors too. Their whispering stopped as soon as Vaughn entered the room. Sir, one of the guards, Jeffries, spoke nervously. There's something you need to see. Vaughn raised an eyebrow. What's going on? Jeffries turned to the screen in front of him, his hands shaking slightly as he rewound the footage from cell 9. The grainy black and white image flickered as it came into view. First, everything looked normal. The empty hallway, the abandoned cells. Then, at exactly 2:43 a.m., something appeared on the monitor. A figure. It was a blurry shape at first, nothing more than a dark shadow in the far corner of the frame. But as the camera adjusted, the figure became clearer. It was the man, the one from cell 9. Vaughn leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. He was just in there with us? He muttered, disbelief creeping into his voice. How is he back on camera? The figure on the screen moved, twitched like a glitch in the footage, but then it stepped forward. The man, if you could call him that, looked identical to the one they had just encountered. The same ragged clothes, the same haunted expression. Then the screen froze. The figure vanished. No trace. Nothing. Barnes exhaled sharply, his eyes darting between the screen and Vaughn. That wasn't possible. Vaughn remained silent for a long moment, his hands gripping the edge of the desk. His mind spun with thoughts of time loops, of madness, of the eerie presence of something beyond their understanding. He had lived through riots, death, and the darkest secrets of Blackstone, but this was beyond anything he had ever encountered. Maybe it's some kind of trick, Jeffries offered, but his voice was weak. Even he didn't believe his own words. It's not a trick, Barnes replied, his voice steady now, though his heart raced. We both saw him, that man, or whatever he is. He's been there for years, and now I think he's trapped, stuck in the same night, over and over. Vaughn turned to him slowly, his expression unreadable. What are you suggesting, Barnes? That we're dealing with something supernatural here? Some sort of haunting? Barnes opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He didn't know what to say. The truth was, there was no explanation that could make sense of what they had just witnessed. No scientific reasoning, no logical conclusion that would fit the nightmare they were experiencing. The prison was old, ancient even, but something about Cell 9 felt like it held a power that went beyond walls, beyond metal bars and locks. There was something there, a presence that lingered, a force that trapped people in its grasp, and perhaps it wasn't just the man who had been confined in that cell. The very prison itself might be the prison. Vaughn leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes. We'll check the history. We'll review everything, reports, archives, anything we can find about Cell 9. But right now, I want everyone to keep quiet about this. No rumors, no hysteria. We'll get to the bottom of this, and I won't have my men running scared. Barnes nodded, but deep down, he knew the truth. There was no running from this. Whatever was going on in Cell 9 wasn't something that could be easily explained or understood. And the man, or the thing, that had been trapped there for 30 years wasn't the only thing in the building. There was something much darker lurking in the heart of Blackstone. The walls of Blackstone Penitentiary groaned under the weight of the night. It was a sound the guards had long since grown accustomed to, the slow, torturous creak of metal and brick, like the very structure of the prison was straining against the passage of time. But tonight, that familiar sound carried a weight that was far heavier than usual, as if the walls themselves were whispering, begging for release. Vaughn stood alone in the control room, the dim light of the monitors casting long shadows over his tired face. The rest of the team had been sent home, though none of them had slept. How could they? The images from Cell 9 kept replaying in their minds, looping like the strange, disjointed footage from the security cameras. Barnes had tried to push it from his thoughts, but the eerie silence in the hallways seemed to carry an echo of something ancient and malevolent. Vaughn rubbed his eyes, feeling the exhaustion clawing at his body. He hadn't slept in 20 hours, but the urgency of the situation kept him awake. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the cusp of something far worse than they understood, something they had stumbled into by accident. But what exactly was it? He glanced at the monitor again. The cameras were showing the usual empty cells, the bleak, cold corridors. Nothing out of the ordinary, but the flickering light in the far corner of the screen caught his attention. It was in the corner of the screen by Cell 9, faint but unmistakable. There was a figure standing there. Vaughn leaned forward, his heart pounding. The figure was indistinct, just a shadow at first. But as the camera adjusted, it became clearer. The man, the one from Cell 9, was standing in the hallway, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. His eyes locked onto the camera with an intensity that sent a shiver down Vaughn's spine. The figure didn't move. He stood there, just watching. Vaughn's breath caught in his throat. He reached for the intercom, his voice a whisper as he spoke into it. Barnes, get to the control room. Now. There was a long pause, and then Barnes's voice crackled over the speaker. What's going on? You need to see this, Vaughn replied, his voice tight. Moments later, Barnes burst into the room, his face pale and eyes wide with anxiety. He rushed to the screen, his gaze flicking to the corner where the figure stood motionless. That's him, Barnes said, his voice barely audible, like speaking any louder would make the thing on the screen come alive. But how? He's not supposed to be there. I don't know, Vaughn muttered, his eyes locked on the monitor. But it's not just the footage. It's the way he's standing, like he's waiting. They both watched in silence, the seconds stretching into eternity as the figure remained in the corner of the screen, unblinking. Then, without warning, the image on the screen distorted like a glitch in the system. The figure vanished for a split second, only to reappear right in front of the camera, standing too close to the lens. The camera trembled, its image warping, as if the presence was somehow manipulating the very technology. Barnes jumped back, his heart racing. This is impossible. He can't just appear like that. But the figure was still there, now closer than ever, its face just inches from the camera. The eyes, those dark, hollow eyes, stared straight into the lens. It felt like the thing on the screen could see them, could reach out and pull them in. A sense of dread washed over both men as the room seemed to close in on them. Then the figure spoke. At first, it was just a whisper, barely audible over the hum of the equipment. But the whisper grew louder, clearer, until it became unmistakable. "Help me." The voice was ragged, desperate. It sounded like it had come from the very depths of suffering, like it had been trapped in an eternity of pain. It was the same voice that had echoed through the prison halls all those nights, screaming from cell 9. But this time, it wasn't just a cry for help. It was a plea for something much darker. Barnes's hands trembled as he reached for the controls, his fingers unsure as he fumbled to adjust the audio levels. But no matter how high he turned the volume, the voice grew louder and louder, filling the room, drowning them in its haunting echoes. "Help me!" Vaughn's eyes widened in horror. The figure on the screen was no longer just a shadow. It was alive. The man, or whatever it was staring at them, its mouth moving in sync with the words that echoed in the control room. "Help me!" And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the screen flickered and the figure vanished. Silence fell over the room, a heavy, suffocating silence that pressed down on their chests. The monitor showed nothing but static. For a long moment, neither man spoke. It was as though the very air had been sucked out of the room. I don't know what's going on, Vaughn," Barnes finally whispered, his voice cracking. "This isn't just some prank. There's something wrong with this place. I think we've opened a door we can't close." Vaughn didn't respond. His gaze was fixed on the blank screen, his mind reeling. The thing in cell 9, the man who had been trapped for 30 years, wasn't just a prisoner. He was a conduit, a link to something far darker. Something that had been festering in the prison for decades, waiting for the right moment to break free. Barnes stepped back from the console, his eyes darting nervously around the control room. "We need to tell the warden. We need to get out of here." "No," Vaughn said, his voice firm despite the fear gnawing at him. "We're not telling anyone about this. Not yet. We don't have enough answers." He couldn't explain why, but he knew something else was coming. There was more to this than just one prisoner, one haunting. The prison had been hiding something that had been locked away for years, and now it was starting to bleed into their reality. Barnes looked at him, bewildered. "What do you mean?" "We've seen it, Vaughn. It's real." "I know," Vaughn said, his voice low. "But what if this is just the beginning?" Just then, the lights flickered, plunging the control room into darkness. The room was swallowed by shadows. The hum of the prison systems died, leaving only the sound of their breathing. And then came the voice again. From the darkness, it whispered, "Help me!" But this time it was coming from all around them. The prison was alive. Story 5. Detective Alex Harris sat in his cramped office, the dim light of the desk lamp casting long shadows over the piles of case files. The day had been a grueling one, filled with dead ends and uncooperative witnesses. But as always, the job had to go on, the weight of every unsolved case pressing heavily on his shoulders. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples, trying to shake the fatigue that clung to him. It was then that his partner, Detective Maria Gallo, walked into the room. She didn't look surprised to find him still at the office. She knew Harris's work ethic. They'd spent years together on the force, building an unspoken understanding of each other. "Another long night, huh?" Maria asked, her voice casual but laced with concern. "Yeah, you could say that." Harris let out a tired sigh, glancing at the clock. It was past midnight, and the case he was working on wasn't getting any clearer. There had been a string of mysterious disappearances in the city, people vanishing without a trace. The only thing that connected them was the odd, unsettling feeling that seemed to linger in the air whenever the victims were mentioned. Maria pulled up a chair and sat across from him, her eyes scanning the files scattered across the desk. "You're not going to crack this case by staying up all night, Harris. You need rest." He shook his head. "Rest won't help me figure out who's behind this. We're missing something, Maria. Something important." Maria opened her mouth to respond, but was interrupted by a knock at the door. A uniformed officer stood in the doorway, holding an evidence bag. "Detective Harris, we found something at the scene of the latest disappearance. Thought you should take a look." Harris frowned and stood up, taking the evidence bag from the officer. Inside, there was a small, old-fashioned cassette tape. It looked out of place among the high-tech evidence they usually handled. He turned it over in his hands, but there were no labels, no identifying marks. "Where did you find this?" Harris asked, his brow furrowing. "It was on the floor in the victim's apartment. No sign of a struggle, but it was the only thing out of place," the officer explained. Harris's curiosity piqued. "You can go. I'll take it from here." The officer nodded and left the room, closing the door behind him. Harris turned the cassette over in his hands again, then looked at Maria. "What do you think this is?" "I don't know," Maria said with a shrug. "But it looks old. Maybe it's some sort of clue." "Maybe," Harris muttered, his fingers instinctively reaching for the cassette player on his desk. He slid the tape inside, the machine clicking to life. The room was silent for a moment before the soft whir of the tape started to play. At first, there was nothing but static. But then, a faint, distorted noise emerged from the speakers. It was hard to make out at first, but it sounded like breathing. Slow, ragged breaths, as if someone was hiding, trying to remain unnoticed. Then, there was a sound that made Harris freeze. The unmistakable sound of a struggle, clothes rustling, a chair being knocked over, and then a scream, a horrible, guttural scream, one that made his blood run cold. Maria stood up, her face pale as the sounds of terror echoed through the small office. She reached for the tape recorder to stop it, but Harris held up his hand, his eyes glued to the machine. He couldn't look away. He had to know what happened next. The scream continued, followed by a series of heavy, rapid footsteps, as if someone was running. The sound grew louder, as though it was drawing closer and closer, until it was almost unbearable. Then it suddenly cut off. The silence that followed was suffocating, as though the air itself had been drained from the room. And then, a voice. It was soft at first, barely a whisper, but Harris could hear it clearly. "Detective Harris." His heart stopped. The voice on the tape spoke his name. Harris's breath caught in his throat, and for a moment, he couldn't move. His hand hovered over the stop button, but he couldn't bring himself to press it. His mind raced. How was it possible? This was a tape from a crime scene, one that had yet to happen. Was it a prank? A hoax? But as his eyes locked on the recorder, he knew this was no ordinary tape. The voice whispered again, this time more urgently. "Detective Harris, you're next." A chill ran down his spine, and his mind reeled, trying to process what he was hearing. He reached for the player, his hands shaking, and yanked the tape out. The silence that followed felt like a void, a deafening quiet that seemed to consume the entire room. Maria was staring at him, her expression one of disbelief. "What the hell was that?" "I don't know," Harris replied, his voice hoarse. He stood up and began pacing, his mind racing. This didn't make sense. This couldn't be real. How could anyone know his name? How could they know about him, about the things he'd been working on? Did Did you recognize the voice? Maria asked, her tone shaking slightly. Harris shook his head. No, but whoever it was, they knew something. They knew me. Maybe we should take it to forensics, Maria suggested. But Harris was already lost in his thoughts. He couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was on its way. Something he wasn't prepared for. Without saying another word, Harris walked to the window and stared out at the city below. The streets were empty, save for the occasional car that passed by. But in the back of his mind, he kept hearing that whisper. It echoed, faint and distant, but it was there. Detective Harris, you're next. He slammed his fist against the window, his anger rising. This wasn't just a random tape. This was a warning. Someone knew something, and they wanted him to know they were coming for him. He turned to face Maria, his jaw set. We need to figure out where this came from. Now. The morning light crept in through the blinds, casting pale stripes across Detective Harris's cluttered desk. His eyes were bloodshot, his mind still reeling from the chilling voice on the cassette tape. The whispers, the scream. It all felt like a premonition, a warning that was impossible to ignore. But he couldn't afford to dwell on it. There was work to be done. Maria Gallo sat across from him, silently reviewing the notes they had gathered from the crime scenes. She looked as exhausted as he felt, her face pale and drawn. The tension in the room was thick, the air heavy with a sense of impending doom. Harris tried to shake it off, but it clung to him like a second skin. So, what do we do now? Maria asked, breaking the silence that had settled over the office. Harris stared at the cassette tape, which sat ominously on the edge of his desk. It was a simple, unlabeled item, but it felt like a ticking bomb. He had no idea how to proceed, but one thing was clear. He had to figure out where the tape came from and why it had his name on it. The voice on that recording had sounded too real, too intimate, to be anything other than a threat. I think we need to find out who made that tape, Harris said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. And we need to figure out what the hell is going on with these disappearances. Maria nodded, a frown tugging at the corners of her mouth. You're right, but we don't have much to go on. We don't even know where this tape came from. It wasn't found at any of the recent crime scenes. Harris's mind was already racing, pulling together the pieces, the disappearances, the voices, the connection to the victim. Something wasn't adding up, and he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being led down a path, one that would end with him as the next victim. We'll have to go through every detail again, Harris said. Everything's connected. I can feel it. He grabbed his jacket and stood up, his movements sharp. Let's go back to the last crime scene. Maybe there's something we missed. The scene was eerily calm when they arrived. The apartment was still cordoned off, police tape crisscrossing the entrance. The building itself looked ordinary enough, an aging structure in the heart of the city. But Harris had a feeling that something sinister lurked beneath its surface. Stay alert, he said to Maria as they entered. We're not just looking for evidence anymore. We're looking for a connection. The apartment was exactly as they'd left it the day before. The furniture was untouched, the place still holding the faint scent of the victim's perfume. But the longer Harris stared at the room, the more he felt the presence of something unseen, something waiting just out of sight. As they moved through the apartment, Maria stopped near the victim's desk. Harris, take a look at this. Harris walked over and peered at the pile of papers spread out before her. Among the bills and correspondence was a notebook, its cover stained and worn. Maria flipped it open and revealed a series of jotted notes, seemingly incoherent. This looks like a journal, she said, her voice tinged with curiosity. But the entries don't make any sense. Harris leaned in, scanning the pages. The writing was erratic, as if the author was racing against time to get everything down. But one entry caught his attention. It was dated just days before the victim's disappearance. The phone rings every night. It's the same voice. It's him. I hear it now, even when I don't pick up. Harris felt his stomach tighten. The entry seemed like a cryptic warning, but it was written by the victim, someone who had heard the same voice that had whispered his name on the tape. Could this be connected? Maria asked, her voice barely above a whisper. It has to be, Harris replied, his mind spinning. The voice on the tape, the victim's journal, the disappearances. All of it was starting to weave together into a pattern that made his skin crawl. He had to dig deeper, but he wasn't sure how much longer he could keep his composure. He turned to Maria, his jaw clenched. Let's go through everything, every detail. We're missing something. Hours later, after sifting through piles of paperwork and re-examining the scene, Harris and Maria returned to the station. Harris felt no closer to finding an answer, but he couldn't shake the sense of urgency that gnawed at him. Whoever or whatever was behind this, it was getting closer, and soon it would be his turn. Maria opened a file on her computer. I found something strange, she said, her voice sharp with alarm. The last victim, his phone records, he called someone just before he disappeared. It was a phone booth, the same one that's been showing up in the records of every other victim. Harris's pulse quickened. He knew that phone booth. It was located on the outskirts of town, an old, dilapidated structure that most people avoided, the kind of place where bad things happened. That's it, he said, slamming his fist against the desk. We need to get to that phone booth. Now. The night air was cold as they drove to the location. The streetlights flickered in the distance, casting long shadows on the cracked pavement. As they neared the booth, Harris's grip tightened on the steering wheel. It looked as desolate and abandoned as it had in the records. But there was something different about it tonight, something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. Maria pulled up to the curb and the two detectives got out. The booth stood at the edge of the road, a solitary figure in the darkness. Harris approached it cautiously, his senses heightened, every muscle in his body tense. He felt as if they were walking into a trap. The door creaked open as Harris stepped inside. The air inside was thick with the smell of stale smoke and old paper. The faint hum of the phone line buzzed in the background, but there was no sound of movement, no sign that anyone had been there recently. He picked up the receiver, his heart pounding. It was cold to the touch, its surface worn and chipped from years of neglect. He dialed the number listed in the records, the same number the victims had called before disappearing. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. But before Harris could hang up, a voice came through the line. Detective Harris. It whispered, You're getting closer, but it's too late. Harris's blood ran cold. The eerie voice on the other end of the line echoed in Detective Harris's head, repeating its chilling words. You're getting closer, but it's too late. The receiver slipped from his trembling fingers and hit the booth floor with a hollow thud. Harris's heart raced, the cold air outside mixing with the deep chill that had suddenly crept over his skin. He could feel it now, a presence lurking just beyond the edges of his perception. Something was watching him, waiting, and with every step he took closer to the truth, the grip of fear tightened around his chest. Maria, standing just outside the booth, stared at him through the grimy glass, her brow furrowed in concern. Her voice called out to him, but it sounded distant, muffled by the growing static in his mind. Harris? You okay? He didn't respond immediately, still caught in the haunting reverberations of that voice. Finally, he managed to pull himself together enough to step out of the booth, locking eyes with her. His mind raced through the possibilities, each one more disturbing than the last. It was clear now that whoever or whatever was behind this had been orchestrating these disappearances for much longer than they had anticipated. And every victim had been a step closer to him. We need to get back to the station, Harris muttered, his voice strained, barely louder than a whisper. Back in the quiet confines of their office, Harris felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him like a vice. His every move felt deliberate, his mind methodically piecing together the puzzle. But the more he searched for answers, the further he seemed to fall into the web of mystery surrounding the phone booth, the recordings, and the victims. He stared at the cassette tape, still sitting ominously on the desk. It had been silent for hours, but Harris could almost hear it calling to him. He had to play it again. He had to know what came next. Are you sure about this? Maria's voice cut through his thoughts. You've already heard it once. What if it just pulls you deeper? Harris hesitated, glancing at her, then back at the tape. He had seen the pattern in the other victim's journal, felt the unease grow with each passing day, but there was no choice. He had to confront this head-on. If there was any chance of stopping this, he had to know the full truth. I have to hear it again, Harris said, his voice quiet but resolute. Maria nodded reluctantly and turned to leave the room, sensing his need for space. Harris sat alone in the dim light, the hum of the fluorescent lights above the only sound in the room. He placed the tape into the recorder and pressed play. The same muffled sounds filled the room, followed by the familiar screams, the cries of someone in agony. Then there it was, the voice. Detective Harris? Do you hear it now? The clock is ticking. You can't stop what's coming. The voice was unmistakable. It was the same one from the phone booth, the same one that had whispered his name. But there was something different now. This time, the voice didn't just warn him. It challenged him. You've been asking the wrong questions. It continued, its tone taunting, almost gleeful. You think you're looking for a killer, but you're not. You're looking for the one who never died, the one who always returns. Harris's breath caught in his throat. The tape played on, the distorted sound of someone sobbing, followed by the unsettling click of a door closing. Then the voice spoke again. Your apartment, it's already begun. Harris shot up from his chair, panic surging through him. His apartment. He had to get back. He had to get there now. Maria met him in the hallway, concern etched across her face as she saw the fear in his eyes. What's wrong? It's happening, Harris replied, his voice tight with urgency. We need to go. Now. They rushed out of the building and into the car. Harris's hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white with tension. The streets seemed endless, the city stretching out before him like an ocean of concrete and steel. But all he could think about was his apartment, the tape, the voice. It was too close now. He could feel it, creeping just behind him. The weight of every footstep on the pavement, every twist of the steering wheel, was a step closer to whatever awaited him in his apartment. As they neared his building, Harris could already see the flashing lights of police cars. His heart sank. Something was wrong. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach. He slammed the brakes as they pulled up to the curb, his pulse racing. Officers were gathered outside his apartment complex, some of them speaking in hushed tones, others glancing nervously at the building. What happened? Harris demanded, rushing toward one of the officers. Detective Harris, you need to come with us, the officer said, his voice shaky. There's been a disturbance inside your apartment. Harris's mind raced, his body moving on autopilot as he followed the officer into the building. The hallways were eerily quiet, and as they reached his door, Harris could see it, the faint outline of a figure standing in his apartment window. But there was something wrong. The figure wasn't moving. It was waiting. As they entered the apartment, the air felt heavy, oppressive. Everything was exactly as he had left it, except for one thing. The cassette tape, which he had left on his desk, was now sitting on his living room table. Did you find this? Harris asked, turning to the officer. The officer shook his head. No, sir. We didn't touch anything. Harris's heart raced as he picked up the tape. It felt cold in his hands, the weight of it a silent reminder of everything that had led up to this moment. He knew what he had to do. He placed the tape into the recorder. The room fell silent as he hit play. The same voice, now clearer than ever, filled the room. You've made it this far, detective, but it's too late. You are the last confession, the last piece of the puzzle. Harris froze. His eyes widened as he realized the terrifying truth. The voice on the tape wasn't just a warning. It was the confession of a killer who had been waiting for him all along. And now the final act was about to begin. As the last words of the tape echoed through the apartment, Harris felt the presence behind him. He turned slowly, dread creeping over him like a shadow. In the corner of the room, a figure stood, motionless. And in the stillness of that moment, Harris finally understood. The killer had been with him the entire time. The road stretched endlessly ahead, the fading tail lights of the few passing cars the only signs of life on the highway. It had been a long day, miles of desert highways, endless fields, and nothing but the hum of the engine to keep the driver company. A weary traveler, with a face drawn from hours of solitude, pulled his car into the dimly lit parking lot of a small motel. Its flickering neon sign buzzed faintly in the cold night air. The Last Stop Motel. The building was old, the kind of place that seemed frozen in time, but it was clean enough and offered a warm bed for the night. He just needed a few hours of rest before continuing his journey the next morning. The bell on the door jingled as he entered the office, a bell he had almost forgotten still existed in the world of modern motels. The receptionist looked up from behind the counter, a woman in her mid-40s with tired eyes and a voice as flat as the motel's decor. "Good evening," she said, her words a soft echo in the quiet space. "I'll take a room for the night," the traveler replied, his voice hoarse from too many hours on the road. "Preferably something quiet." She gave him a polite nod. "Room 12's available. It's a bit off to the side, so it should be quiet." He nodded gratefully, signed in, and paid the small fee. She handed him a key, its metal tag clinking as he took it from her. The woman's eyes lingered on him for a moment before she spoke again, her voice softer now. "If you need anything, just let me know." "But—" she hesitated, almost as if considering whether or not to speak her mind. "There's something you should know about that room." The traveler raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" She didn't immediately answer, instead glancing toward the door of the office. It was clear she didn't want to share the story, but some compulsion made her speak. "The room has been empty for a while, since the incident. No one stays there long. Something about that room. People just say they feel uneasy there." He was too tired to think much of it. A lot of motels, especially old ones, had their fair share of rumors. "I'll be fine," he said, flashing a tired smile. "Thanks." The woman gave him a stiff smile in return. "All right then, enjoy your stay." The room was small but functional. A faded quilt on the bed, an old lamp beside it casting a weak light across the worn carpet. It was the kind of room that had seen better days, but it was exactly what he needed. No frills, no distractions, just rest. He unpacked his small bag, tossing his jacket over the chair and setting his phone on the nightstand. Exhaustion had settled in like a heavy blanket, and before long, he was under the covers, the quiet hum of the motel's air conditioner a steady lullaby. But sleep didn't come as easily as it should have. It started as a faint tapping, almost imperceptible, coming from the wall beside him. At first, he thought it was just the usual noises of an old building. Creaks and groans as the wind rattled the windows or the building settled in for the night. But it wasn't the wind. It was rhythmic, steady, like a knock one after another. He rolled over, staring at the wall, trying to shake off the rising unease. The knocking continued, each thud a little louder than the last. It wasn't enough to be unsettling at first, just a mild curiosity, something to distract him from his inability to sleep. But as the sound continued, it began to gnaw at his nerves. It was coming from the room next door. Frowning, he swung his legs out from under the covers and stood. He walked quietly to the door, pressing his ear to the thin wall that separated his room from the one beside it. The knocking was louder now, and the rhythm was deliberate. 3 knocks, a brief pause, then again 3 knocks, then silence. It was as if whoever was in the room next door was trying to get his attention. He glanced at the door to the hallway, unsure what to do. Was someone playing a prank? Was it just the sound of the building itself shifting? The next morning, the traveler stopped by the office to return the key and check out. The woman behind the desk was the same, though there was a new tightness in her expression. "Did you sleep well?" she asked, not quite meeting his eyes. "Not really," he replied, rubbing his temples. "There was this knocking coming from the room next door. I tried to ignore it, but it kept me up all night." Her face paled slightly, and she gave a stiff nod. "I'm sorry about that," she said quickly, not giving him time to say anything further. "Like I said, that room's..." Not really for guests anymore. There's a history with it. He frowned, suddenly curious. What happened there? The receptionist hesitated for a moment before speaking again. Her voice quieter now, as though she were telling a story she had told 1,000 times but never wanted to repeat. The last person who stayed in that room, well, he was a loner, like most of our guests here, but he didn't just stay one night. He stayed for weeks. People said he was a quiet man, kept to himself. But no one really knows what he did here. Some say he was a killer. He would target people who came through alone, looking for company. We think he still haunts the place, looking for new friends. She glanced at him, her eyes wide with fear, and added, "That's why no one stays in that room anymore." The traveler left the motel, his mind heavy with the words of the receptionist. As he drove away, he couldn't help but glance back at the fading lights of the motel in his rearview mirror. He had never believed in ghosts or curses, but something about that place gnawed at him. The knocking, the strange tension in the air. Was it all just a coincidence? But deep down, a quiet voice in his mind whispered the truth. The killer had never left. And the room? It was always waiting for someone new. The road stretched ahead, but the further the traveler went, the less he could shake the eerie feeling that had settled in his chest. He had stayed at many motels during his years of travel, each one blending into the next with no real distinction. But this one, the last stop motel, had left an impression, one that he couldn't quite escape. He had tried to push it out of his mind as he continued his journey, telling himself it was just an old building, creaking under the weight of its age. But the memory of the knocking, the rhythm of those 3 distinct knocks that had plagued his night, kept him awake. He had barely slept, his mind replaying the eerie sound, wondering if it was just a figment of his tired imagination. The idea of the murderer who had once occupied room 12, as the receptionist had described, haunted him. It was an unsettling thought, but something about it felt off. Why was the room still vacant? If the killer had truly been as dangerous as she implied, why didn't they shut down the entire motel? The more he thought about it, the more questions emerged. The longer he drove, the heavier the weight of those questions grew. Eventually, he found himself pulling into another roadside stop for gas, only to realize he wasn't just refueling his car. He was refueling his own doubts. The gas station was one of those places that seemed to exist in limbo. It was small, worn, a relic of a bygone era where time didn't seem to matter. As he filled up his tank, the gas station attendant, a woman in her 50s with graying hair and tired eyes, watched him from behind the counter. She didn't say anything at first, but after a long, lingering silence, she spoke, her voice low and careful. "You're from the last stop motel, aren't you?" she asked, her words not exactly a question but a knowing observation. The traveler glanced up at her, startled. He hadn't told anyone where he was coming from. "Yeah," he said, his voice tight. "Why do you ask?" The woman's expression shifted slightly, as though she had to weigh whether she wanted to share whatever knowledge she had. Finally, she leaned toward the counter and spoke in a hushed tone. "You're not the first to mention it, you know." He froze, the gas pump still in his hand. "What do you mean?" "People who stay there," she continued, eyes darting to the side to make sure no one was listening. "They always say the same thing. That room, room 12, there's something wrong with it. It doesn't matter who stays in it. They hear noises. They feel watched. And some say they feel something more than just the air. Something else." The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. "Something else." She nodded almost regretfully. "The room's been empty since the incident, but it wasn't always like that. It used to be just like any other. People would stay there, not think twice about it, until they started disappearing. Just 1 or 2 at first, but it grew. Then the knocks began. People heard them in the middle of the night, knocking on the walls, knocking on the door. 3 knocks, same as you." His throat tightened. "And what happened to them?" The woman shifted uncomfortably, as though reluctant to speak the truth. "Well, the motel started to get a reputation. No one wants to stay there anymore. I think it's cursed, honestly. But the owners, well, they don't care much for the rumors. They just keep renting out the room to anyone who'll take it. People are always passing through, after all. They think it doesn't matter. The traveler's heart beat faster. But why doesn't anyone do something about it? Why hasn't the room been locked up? She sighed, her face shadowed with worry. Because the owner is a stubborn man, and he doesn't believe in curses. He thinks it's all just coincidence. But I know better, and so does everyone who stayed there. A long silence hung between them before she spoke again, her voice quieter this time. You shouldn't go back to that motel. Trust me. His hand lingered on the gas pump as he absorbed her words. The unease he had felt earlier now a solid weight in his chest. But despite the warning, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being drawn back. There was something about room 12, something that felt unfinished, and he couldn't rest until he figured it out. By the time he returned to the last stop motel, the sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the empty parking lot. It was quiet, eerily quiet. The air felt still, as though time itself had slowed to watch his arrival. As he approached the office, the same receptionist from the previous night sat behind the desk, her eyes cast down, not meeting his gaze. He hesitated before stepping inside, the sound of the bell echoing in the otherwise silent office. She looked up briefly, then lowered her gaze again. "Back so soon?" she asked, her voice tinged with a sort of resigned sadness. "Thought you'd left." He nodded, not bothering with pleasantries. "I need to talk to you about room 12. At the mention of the room number, the woman's face grew pale, her lips pressed together tightly. She didn't speak right away, only stared at him with wide, almost fearful eyes. You shouldn't have gone back," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I tried to warn you. People don't stay there long, but they don't leave the same either." The traveler swallowed hard. What happened to them? The ones who disappeared? She flinched at the question, her hands trembling slightly as she folded them on the counter. There were 5 of them. At least that's how many we know of. And each one heard the knocking. They'd wake up to it right at midnight. 3 knocks. Then nothing. The next night it'd be the same. 3 knocks. And each night it would get closer. He leaned in, his curiosity pushing him forward. "Closer? What do you mean?" Her voice dropped to a near whisper, her eyes darting around the room. "It's the room itself. The knocking starts at the wall next to you. But by the 3rd night, it's right at your door. And when it gets to your door, you never know what happens." No one who heard the knocks ever came back to tell their story. The room felt colder, the air thick with something unspoken. His eyes locked with hers, and he knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that he had to return to room 12. There was no other choice. The mystery had already dug its claws into him, and no matter how much he wanted to leave, he knew he was already too far gone. As night fell and the lights of the motel flickered overhead, the traveler made his way back to room 12. The knocking would come. He could feel it in the air, its presence like an old, lingering memory. It was inevitable, but this time he would be ready. He had to be. The night was alive with an unnatural stillness, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The traveler stood before room 12, his hand resting on the cold metal knob. The air around him felt dense, heavy with the weight of what was about to unfold. The warning from the gas station attendant, the receptionist's fearful eyes, and the nagging doubt in his gut. They all clawed at him, telling him to turn away. But he couldn't. Not now. With a steadying breath, he pushed the door open. The room was exactly as he remembered it. Dimly lit, the wallpaper peeling at the edges, the faint scent of mildew in the air. The bed, still covered in the same faded floral sheets, stood untouched. The window, framed by heavy curtains, offered no view of the outside world. But it didn't need to. The room itself held its own secret, a secret that only those brave or foolish enough to stay could ever truly understand. He walked inside, his footsteps muffled by the threadbare carpet beneath his feet. His heart pounded, but he forced himself to steady his breath. This time, he wouldn't be the one to leave. No, tonight, he would face whatever was haunting this room. Tonight, he would uncover the truth. The clock on the wall ticked, marking the passage of time with an almost mocking precision. It was already well past midnight, and still, there was only silence. The knocking, which had plagued him for the last few nights, had yet to begin. The traveler sat on the edge of the bed, his gaze fixed on the door. He wasn't sure what he was waiting for, whether it was the knock itself or something more, something worse. The silence grew oppressive, thick with the promise of something unspeakable. Then suddenly it came. Knock, knock, knock. 3 distinct knocks. The sound echoed through the room, vibrating in his chest like the beat of a war drum. His pulse quickened. The knocks, they were right there. The same rhythm, the same pattern he had heard each night. But now they weren't coming from the wall. No, they were coming from the door. The knocks grew louder, closer. Every time the sound echoed, it seemed to move a step nearer to him. It was like a voice beckoning him, calling him toward the inevitable. And just like before, there were only 3 knocks. His fingers tightened around the bedpost, his breath shallow. He wanted to run, to escape, but he couldn't. Something inside him, something dark and primal, held him in place. It was as though the room itself had a hold on him, refusing to let go. The knocking grew louder, closer. A voice, low and barely audible, whispered from the other side of the door. "Let me in." The words sent a chill through his spine. It was a voice that sounded familiar, though he couldn't place it. It was guttural, desperate, as though the speaker had been through unspeakable horrors. But there was something else to it, something that gnawed at his mind. Something about the voice seemed wrong. He stood up, his legs trembling beneath him. His hand hovered over the doorknob, but before he could turn it, the voice spoke again, louder this time. "Let me in, or you'll never leave." His hand shot back. The voice wasn't just from the door, it was in the room with him. The walls themselves seemed to be whispering, the air thick with an unseen presence. The knocks had stopped, replaced by the unmistakable sound of something, or someone, scratching at the door. He backed away, his breath caught in his throat. His mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. Who was on the other side? What did they want? And why was this happening? But before he could answer, the door creaked, as though someone was trying to push it open from the other side. And then the lights flickered. The room went black. For a moment, there was only silence. But it wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence of waiting, of something unseen but very much present, biding its time. He strained his ears, his heart hammering in his chest. And then knock, knock, knock. The knocking resumed, louder than ever. But this time, it didn't come from the door. It was coming from inside the room, from the walls, from the very floor beneath his feet. The knocking seemed to surround him, pulsing in time with his heartbeat. His eyes darted from corner to corner, but all he could see was the darkness. Empty, hollow darkness, stretching into infinity. Then the scratching started again, this time from the ceiling. It was as though something was clawing its way out of the very fabric of the room. And then, a voice broke the silence. "I'm here." It was unmistakable now. The voice from the door. It was in the room with him, right behind him. He turned sharply, but there was nothing there. Only the suffocating darkness. His mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. The knocking, the voice, the scratching, was it real? Was it all in his head? Or was this room, this motel, cursed in ways he couldn't comprehend? Suddenly, the lights returned. But the room was different. The walls had shifted. The bed was now against the far wall. The furniture rearranged as though someone had been in here before him. The floorboards groaned under his weight, and when he looked down, he saw something in the shadows. A hand, A pale, lifeless hand reaching out from beneath the floorboards. It wasn't his hand. The traveler staggered back, his mind spinning. He had to leave. He had to get out. But before he could make it to the door, it slammed shut on its own. He was trapped. The room was alive. The end. Thank you for joining us tonight in this chilling journey. If you found yourself holding your breath, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more unnerving tales from the darkness. And remember, as always, stay safe. But keep your doors locked, for you never know who or what might be knocking at your door next. This is Mr. Darsnights, signing off. Sleep well, if you can.